Look at him. Still nothing, still a nobody, and he had the nerve to come to my wedding. Did you come here to relive old times, or just to remind yourself what you lost?
No, I'm actually married now.
She said it loud enough for half the reception hall to hear, standing there in white lace under string lights, a champagne glass tilted in my direction like a toast that wasn't one. Her new husband laughed. A few of the guests near the bar laughed too, the easy kind of laugh people give when they think they already know how a story ends. 7 days before that wedding, my legal team had finalized the paperwork that made Hartwell Dynamics the majority shareholder in a rail and energy infrastructure consortium spanning 4 countries. $30 billion in assets under one company. My company. My name on every filing. Nobody in that reception hall knew that yet, least of all the woman standing in the dress, holding a glass of champagne, laughing at a man she assumed still had nothing. My name is Desmond Cole. I'm 44 years old, and for most of my life I believed something my father used to say while he worked, something I didn't understand until long after he was gone. A man's worth isn't measured by what people say about him at a party. It's measured by what he builds in the years nobody's paying attention. My father spent 31 years as a machinist in a plant outside Cleveland, coming home every night with the same grease under his fingernails and the same quiet pride in his walk, whether anyone noticed or not. I didn't understand that pride until I'd lost almost everything and had to build it back with nothing but that same quiet. 9 years ago, my ex-wife Renata packed 2 suitcases and left our apartment on a Tuesday morning without much of a goodbye. I didn't chase her down the stairwell. I didn't call her sister begging for a conversation. I let her go, and I went quiet. Some people mistake quiet for defeat. They've never been the same thing, not once, not in my experience. Which brings us to a Saturday evening in June at a vineyard estate outside Napa. String lights strung between old oak trees, a jazz quartet playing something slow near the dance floor, and Renata standing at the center of it in a dress, marrying a man named Preston Vance. I was there because Renata's cousin, an old friend of mine from college, had insisted I come, not to make a statement, just to finally close a door I'd left cracked open for 9 years. I want to take you back further than that evening, though, because that's really where this story begins, not at the wedding, but in the years before it, in the version of my life that made a moment like that Saturday possible at all. When Renata and I married, I was 29 and working 2 jobs, laying commercial flooring by day and doing IT support contracts by night, trying to save enough to start the software consulting company I'd been sketching out on napkins since college. Renata was ambitious in a way I respected. She wanted a life bigger than the one either of us had grown up in, and for the first few years, I believed we wanted that same life together. There's a night I still think about sometimes, one out of maybe 100 nights like it. Renata had been invited to a certification program for supply chain analytics, the kind of program that could have changed the trajectory of her career, but it cost $4,000 we didn't have. I sold the only thing of real value I owned, my grandfather's tool collection, cherry-handled chisels and planes he'd used for 40 years as a cabinet maker, to cover it. I never told her where the money came from. I didn't need her gratitude. I needed her to have the shot. The night she finished the program's opening ceremony, I stood outside the conference center in the rain for nearly 2 hours because parking downtown had been impossible, and I hadn't wanted to leave in case she needed a ride. When she finally came out and saw me soaked through, she didn't say thank you. She looked at me the way you'd look at something inconvenient and said, "Why do you always look like this? Like you're trying so hard it's embarrassing." I said nothing. I said very little most nights of that marriage. I thought silence was patience. I understand now those are 2 very different things wearing the same coat. There were other nights like that one, smaller in size, not in weight. The year I picked up every overtime shift I could find to cover the deposit on her sister's wedding venue, and she told her family it was her money, her generosity. The Thanksgiving, I drove 3 hours each way to fix her auntie's bathtub for free because it would make the family look good, and came home to a cold plate on the counter and a bedroom door already closed for the night. None of it felt like sacrifice while it was happening. It felt like love, the only language I knew how to speak fluently at the time. I understand now that a man can pour his whole self into a cup someone has already quietly decided not to drink from. I've thought a lot in the years since about why she was the way she was, not to excuse it, but because understanding something is different from forgiving it, and I needed to do the first before I could ever manage the second. Renata grew up watching her mother go without, over and over, married to a man who kept promising a better year that never arrived. She used to tell me, in the early years when she still told me things, that she'd promised herself as a girl she would never again stand in a kitchen waiting on someone else's luck to change. I think she looked at me in those years and saw exactly that kitchen waiting to happen again. A good man, but a slow build, and she'd run out of patience for slow builds a long time before she ever met me. That doesn't make what she did to me right. It just means the cruelty had a root, the way most cruelty does, and the root was fear dressed up as ambition. I didn't understand that until years after she'd already left. By then, it no longer changed anything between us. It just meant I stopped carrying the question of why alongside everything else. What I carried instead, for longer than I probably should have, was a notebook. A plain spiral one, blue, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. I started it maybe a year into the marriage after a night I don't like remembering in much detail. I'll just say it involved a canceled dinner reservation and a sentence about my future that I heard clearly enough to still recite word for word if I had to. I began writing down what she said to me, dated, almost like I was keeping records for a case I hoped I'd never have to make. I told myself it wasn't bitterness. I told myself it was just so I'd remember later that the voice telling me I wasn't enough had a name and a face and wasn't some truth handed down from anywhere sacred. It was just a person having a bad night or a bad year, taking it out on the person closest to her. I kept that notebook in the bottom drawer of my desk for years after the divorce. I never once used it against her. I just needed, some nights, to know it was there. I hadn't wanted to go to the wedding at all, if I'm honest. But her cousin, Marisol, had called me 2 weeks earlier and said something I couldn't quite argue with. You've spent 9 years building yourself back up in silence, Desmond. Go not to prove anything. Go so you can finally close the door properly. I almost said no 3 separate times before I finally said yes. So on that Saturday evening, I put on a plain navy suit, nothing that announced anything, and drove out to the vineyard alone. My wife, Alina, had a board meeting for the literacy foundation she runs that was running long and told me she'd meet me there once it wrapped. I walked into that reception under string lights and the smell of crushed grapes and fresh cut flowers, and the first face I found in the crowd was Renata's. She smiled at me the way people smile when they believe they've already won something. "Well, look who showed up," she said, stepping closer, a glass of champagne loose in her hand, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "Still nothing? Still nobody, Desmond? Or are you still out here doing IT support for whoever will hire you, hoping somebody finally notices?" I looked at her steadily, calm. "No," I said. "I'm married." For 1 full second, the small circle of guests near her went quiet. Then Renata laughed, a big performative laugh, the kind meant to convince everyone listening before it convinces the person laughing. "Married, that's rich, truly." She turned to the people around her like she needed an audience for what came next. "Y'all hear this? Desmond says he's married. A man who couldn't build a stable career in 9 years suddenly has a wife." I kept my voice even. 3 years now. 3 years, she repeated, like the words tasted strange. "And where is this wife tonight? Home? Or maybe she only exists when it's convenient." Standing beside her was a man I hadn't been introduced to yet, tall, groomed within an inch of his life, watching me with an expression that wasn't quite curiosity. Preston. I'd learn his name properly soon enough. What I noticed first wasn't his face, it was his eyes, dropping again and again on the plain steel watch on my wrist, the one that belonged to my father. He wasn't looking at it the way a man looks at something he admires. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a number he's trying and failing to calculate. "She's finishing up a meeting," I said simply. "She'll be here soon." Renata waved a hand like she was swatting away something small. "Sure she is." "Still nothing, Desmond, even if you've invented someone to sit next to you tonight so you don't look so alone at my wedding." I let that pass through me without taking root. Anger is a poor tenant. You let it stay too long, it stops paying rent and starts tearing up the walls. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, more than once. "You know," Renata said, emboldened by the small laugh that rippled through her circle, "the saddest part is you actually believed you'd amount to something. All that talk back when we first met about building something real. And here you are. Same tired suit, same tired face. Some men just don't have it in them." I thought, standing there, about all the years I'd spent believing that if I worked hard enough, quiet enough, long enough, she'd eventually see me. I thought about the man I used to be, standing in the rain outside that conference center, believing his worth was something I had to earn one soaked, silent night at a time. I wasn't that man anymore. Renata simply hadn't gotten the memo yet. "You should slow down," I said, quietly, not unkind, just factual. "You're about to say something you can't take back." She laughed again, but this time there was an edge underneath it, a flicker of something uncertain crossing behind her eyes before her composure smoothed back over it. "Slow down for what, Desmond? I have absolutely nothing to slow down for. I have my life together. I have Preston." She reached for his arm, pulling him half a step closer, presenting him like an exhibit. "And you have what? A watch that doesn't even look real, and an imaginary wife. You know," Renata went on, warming to her own performance now that she thought she had the room, "I actually feel a little sorry for you, Desmond. You always talked like you were going to build some empire someday. I used to believe it too, back when I was young enough to not know better. And here we are, 9 years later, and you're still telling strangers at weddings that you have a wife. It's almost sweet, in a sad way, like a kid who never stopped believing in a version of himself that never showed up. I felt the old version of myself flinch somewhere underneath the calm, the part of me that used to absorb sentences like that one and carry them around for weeks. That part of me had gotten a lot quieter over the years, but it hadn't disappeared entirely, and maybe it never would. I let the silence sit for a second before I answered. "You used to believe a lot of things about me. Some of them turned out true. Some of them you decided weren't worth waiting around to find out." For half a second, something flickered behind her eyes. Not quite doubt yet, but the first hairline crack in a story she'd been telling herself for 9 years. She covered it fast, tossing her hair back, reaching for Preston's arm again like it was a life raft. "Anyway," she said too brightly, "we should let you go find your meeting." Behind her, near the edge of the dance floor, I noticed a face I recognized from years back, Yolanda, a former coworker of Renata's from her early years in supply chain analytics, before she left that career behind entirely once she met Preston. Yolanda now ran compliance audits for a firm that handled vendor verification on large infrastructure contracts, the kind of job that meant she noticed details most people never thought to look for. Back in those early years, she'd been the one person in Renata's circle who told you the truth about your work, even when it wasn't what you wanted to hear. The kind of person people learned not to invite when they wanted easy praise. She was watching this exchange with her arms folded and her jaw set tight, the same way she used to watch things back when we all worked together, the posture of someone who never spoke until she had something worth saying. Somewhere near the entrance to the reception tent, I heard the low murmur of new arrivals, footsteps on the wooden dance floor, and a shift in the air of the room. The particular kind of quiet that falls over a crowd right before it turns to look at something. Renata hadn't heard it yet. She was still talking, still certain the ground beneath her heels was solid. It wasn't, not anymore. The tent's entrance opened fully, and the small string quartet seemed to soften half a step, the way a room does when it decides, without being told, that something important has just walked in. Alina. She wore a deep emerald gown, her hair swept back, moving through that crowd the way people move when they've never once needed a room's permission to belong in it. Heads turned. A woman near the bar whispered to her date just loud enough for me to catch it. Is that Alina Cole, the one who runs the Literacy Foundation? Renata turned to see what everyone else was looking at, and I watched the color drain slowly from her face. Alina crossed the floor straight to me, took my hand in both of hers, and pressed a kiss to my cheek in front of everyone. Sorry I'm late, love, she said, warm and unhurried. That meeting ran long. Renata's mouth opened, then closed. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its edge entirely. Oh, so you're Desmond's wife? Before Alina answered, she leaned in close enough that only I could hear. Marisol called me on the way over, she murmured. She's here and I just got the notification. The consortium deal closed this afternoon. Final signature came through an hour ago. 30 billion. Done. I felt that land quiet and steady in my chest, the way good news does once you've stopped needing it to prove anything to anyone but yourself. Alina straightened, turned to Renata and answered her question directly. No performance in it at all. Yes, I'm his wife, and I'm very proud of my husband. My wife. Not a rumor, not an invention, standing right there in a room that had spent the last 20 minutes calling her imaginary. The tent had gone almost silent. A few feet away, someone's champagne glass hovered halfway to their mouth, forgotten. Renata tried to recover, forcing a laugh that came out thin. Well, that's wonderful. I had no idea Desmond had... She stopped, glanced at me, then back at Alina. Someone like you. Most people don't take the time to find out what someone actually has, Alina said. Still calm, still warm, no malice in it, just fact. Quick task. If you are enjoying and believe stories like this deserve to be heard more, kindly like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Preston shifted his weight beside Renata, and for the first time all evening he looked genuinely uneasy. He'd spent the whole night measuring me like a problem to be solved, and now the math wasn't adding up the way he'd expected. He's a man who reads people for a living, and also knows the exact moment a room turns against him. Preston knew it. He wasn't ready to admit it yet. I want to step back here for a moment, because there's a reason Preston kept looking at me the way he did, and it isn't one I understood myself until later that same night. 2 years before that wedding, when Hartwell Dynamics was still a mid-sized firm bidding on regional energy contracts, a man calling himself a subcontracting consultant approached one of our junior project managers with an offer that seemed almost too convenient, a shell vendor account that could quietly route a portion of our municipal contract payments through a third party, skimming a percentage off every invoice before it ever reached our books. It was clean on paper. It nearly worked. What that consultant hadn't accounted for was that our finance team ran a routine cross-verification on every vendor tied to a public contract, a policy I'd insisted on after watching a competitor lose everything to a scheme almost exactly like it. My compliance director flagged the account within 11 days. We traced the paperwork back through 2 false layers before we found the name behind it, Preston Vance. We never filed publicly. There was no upside in making noise about a scheme that failed before it cost us $1, and dragging it into the press would have cost us more in reputation than the fraud itself ever would have cost us in money. We simply closed the account, blacklisted the vendor, and moved on. I hadn't thought about his name again until I watched him standing beside my ex-wife in a rented tuxedo, staring at my watch like it owed him an explanation. Now, standing in that tent, I understood exactly what I was looking at. A man who'd already tried once to take something from my company through the back door, standing at the front of a wedding he'd built on the same instinct, find the angle, take the shortcut, worry about the consequences only if they arrived. Yolanda hadn't missed any of it either. I could see it in the set of her jaw from across the floor. She'd worked in compliance long enough to recognize the shape of a man like that from across a room, the particular stillness of someone waiting to see if the truth catches up before the night ends. It was about to. Renata, still reeling, turned back toward the small cluster of guests who'd been laughing along with her 20 minutes earlier, searching their faces for the same amusement that had backed her up before. She found none of it. A few of them had already started drifting toward the bar, suddenly very interested in refreshing their drinks. "So," Renata said carefully, testing the ground, "what exactly do you do now, Desmond? Still in IT?" "I run an infrastructure and energy holding company. We closed a deal today across 4 countries. I didn't say the number. I didn't need to. Some truths don't need volume. They just need time to sink in." A server passed nearby with a tray of champagne, and somewhere behind me I heard someone murmur the name of a literacy program at the community center back in our old neighborhood, the one that had quietly expanded from one classroom to an entire building over the past 6 years. Fully funded, nobody ever sure exactly who was behind it.
Yolanda didn't wait for an invitation. She crossed the floor with the steady, unhurried stride of someone who'd been waiting years for the right moment to finally say something out loud. "Renata," she said, her voice carrying clean and clear across the small circle of onlookers. "That's enough." Renata blinked at her, caught off guard. "Yolanda, this doesn't concern you." "It does, actually," Yolanda said, her arms still folded, her tone level, unshaken, "because some of us have known for years exactly what kind of man Desmond is, and we've watched you build an entire evening around pretending otherwise." She paused, letting the silence settle fully before continuing. "What most people here don't know is that for the last 6 years, Desmond has personally funded the literacy program at the East Side Community Center. Every child who's come through that building, every family that's gotten free tutoring and books and a safe place after school, that's him. He never put his name on a plaque. He never told anyone. I only found out by accident going through a routine audit of the center's donor records last spring." A ripple moved through the crowd, heads turning, voices dropping into murmurs. Someone near the back said, quiet but audible, "Wait, that's been Desmond this whole time?" I felt something tighten and loosen in my chest at once. I thought of the first check I'd written 6 years earlier, alone at my kitchen table past midnight, telling myself it didn't need my name attached to matter. I'd expected something like pride hearing it said aloud in front of a room. Instead, I felt oddly exposed, like a door I'd kept locked out of habit had swung open without my permission. I didn't reach for credit. I never had. Yolanda's face had gone pale, her mouth slightly open, no response ready. Yolanda wasn't finished. She turned deliberately towards Preston. "And you," she said, "might want to sit this next part out quietly, because I know exactly what you tried to do to Desmond's company 2 years ago. The shell vendor account, the falsified subcontractor invoices routed through a fake company to skim off a public infrastructure contract. It didn't work, because Desmond's compliance team caught it before it went anywhere. But I have no doubt Renata knew. Didn't you, Renata? You covered for him."
The color left Renata's face entirely. She turned to Preston, her voice cracking. "You told me that was a misunderstanding. You said—" "Don't," Preston said, flatly, stepping back half a step, distancing himself in real time. His hand had gone tight around his glass, the practiced ease sliding off his face for just a half second, replaced by something colder and more calculating. It was the same look he'd worn all night, studying my watch. A man running numbers on an exit, not an apology. A woman near the dessert table murmured to her husband, not quite quietly enough, "I always wondered how Preston afforded that place in the hills on nothing but consulting fees." Word travels fast in a room that's already decided to stop being polite. Marisol appeared at my side sometime in the middle of it all, having crossed the floor the moment things started to unravel. She didn't say anything right away, just stood there with her arms crossed, watching Renata the way you'd watch weather rolling in you'd already predicted years ago. I told you closing the door properly might take the door off its hinges, she murmured to me, low enough that only I could hear. I almost laughed. Almost. Renata turned back towards me, desperation replacing the composure that had carried her through the entire evening. Desmond, you knew about this? About Preston's scheme, and you never said anything? I knew, I said quietly. My compliance team caught it. We handled it without needing to make a scene. She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time in 9 years. Why didn't you ever tell me? Alina answered before I could, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. Because there's something else you should know, Renata. Desmond knew about you and Preston long before the divorce was ever filed. Years before. The room went still enough that I could hear ice shifting in someone's glass 3 feet away. Renata's eyes went wide, then filled, her composure finally breaking all the way through. You knew this whole time? I knew, I said quietly. Then why didn't you say something? Why did you just let it happen? Because for a long time, I said, my voice steady, no anger left in it, just plain truth. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, worked hard enough, you'd eventually choose me on your own. I didn't want to force it. I wanted you to see me. I paused. You never did. And eventually, I stopped needing you to. Renata turned to Preston one last time, her voice breaking into something raw and unguarded. You told me you'd give me the life Desmond never could. You said I'd never have to worry again. What happened to all of that? Preston looked at her with something close to contempt. Don't put that on me right now. Don't put it on you. Her voice cracked louder now, past the point of caring who heard. I lied for you. I told my own mother that place in the hills was legitimate. I told everyone at this wedding tonight that you were the better choice. She was shaking now, the champagne flute in her hand trembling hard enough that a little spilled over the rim and onto her wrist. She didn't seem to notice. Preston straightened his jacket, already halfway to leaving in his mind, if not yet in his feet. That sounds like a you problem. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper, not unkindly, Lord have mercy, the way people do when they've just watched a slow-motion collision they saw coming from a mile off. The crowd around them had thinned considerably, people quietly stepping back from the wreckage, no one wanting to be standing too close when the rest of it came down. I stood there with my wife's hand in mine and felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet, settled kind of stillness. The feeling of a door finally closing all the way after being left cracked open for 9 long years. I thought about all the nights I'd imagined this moment differently. Imagined myself saying something cutting, something that would land the way her words used to land on me. Standing there in that tent, the words never came, and I realized I didn't want them to. There's a version of justice that shouts, and there's a version that simply stands still while the truth does the work for you. I'd spent 9 years learning the difference. Renata wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at the wreckage of her own evening scattered across the floor of a reception tent she'd built for a wedding she wanted badly to be perfect. Yolanda stepped back beside me for a moment, her voice low, just for us. I probably should have said something years ago. You said it exactly when it needed saying, I told her, and I meant it. Marisol squeezed my shoulder once, a small, wordless gesture that said more than any speech could have. I didn't feel the need to say anything else to Renata. There was nothing left to prove, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I turned to Alina, and without a word between us, we both understood it was time to go. Behind me, I heard Renata's voice, thinner now, stripped of every ounce of performance it had carried all night. Desmond, wait! Please, just wait a second. I didn't turn around. We walked out of the vineyard into a clear June night, the air smelling faintly of crushed grapes and cut grass. The parking valet's radio playing something low from a nearby booth. I opened the car door for Alina the way I always do. and we drove back toward the city in silence for a while, the vineyard's lights shrinking in the rearview mirror behind us. Alina finally broke the silence, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "You never told me the whole story, about knowing about the affair before the divorce." I glanced at her. It never felt like something worth carrying into our life. I wasn't keeping it to use against her. I was keeping it so I never mistook her voice for my own on nights I don't like remembering. It never once made me hate her. It just made sure I never forgot who I actually was underneath everything she used to say. Alina squeezed my hand. "You could have said something tonight, after all that." I thought about it, I think. I finally don't need to anymore. "You still have it? The notebook?" "Bottom drawer, same as always." I kept my eyes on the road for a moment. I used to take it out on nights I didn't like remembering, flip to a page dated some ordinary Tuesday, read her old words back to myself like scripture I needed to disprove. It never once made me hate her. It just made sure I never mistook her voice for my own. "You could throw it away now," Alina said gently. "After tonight, of all nights."
"I might," I said. "I think I finally don't need it to remember who I used to be. I think I just know now, without the proof." My phone buzzed once in my jacket pocket at a red light a few miles from home. I glanced at it out of habit more than curiosity. A text from a number I hadn't saved, though I recognized it instantly. "Renata, I'm sorry for tonight, for a lot of things." I looked at it for a long moment, the light still red. Alina glanced over, not asking, just present. "You don't have to answer that tonight," she said quietly. "Or ever, if you don't want to." "I know," I said. I put the phone face down in the cup holder. Some doors don't need to slamming shut. You can just let them ease closed on their own weight. And that's its own kind of answer. We didn't say much else the rest of the drive. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on, the way Alina always leaves it. I sat in the car a second longer than I needed to, just taking it in. The quiet street, the house we'd built the real life inside. My wife beside me, instead of walking ahead of me. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it. I think I actually am. Inside, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the hallway a moment, listening to the house settle around me, the small, ordinary sounds of a life that had nothing left to prove to anybody. Alina put the kettle on, the way she does most nights, whether we need tea or not. It's less about the tea and more about the ritual of it. 10 quiet minutes standing together in the kitchen before the day is finally allowed to end. I sat down at our kitchen table, the same second-hand table we'd bought our first year together, and I thought about Renata standing in that tent, the wreckage of her evenings scattered around her heels. I thought about Preston stepping back from her without a second thought. I thought about 9 years of silence, of quiet work, of choosing not to explain myself to anyone who'd already decided who I was. I thought, too, about the man I used to be, at a smaller version of this same table, in a smaller apartment, doing math in his head at 2 a.m, trying to make a single paycheck stretch across 2 people's expectations. That man would not have believed this kitchen, this quiet, this woman across the table from him. I was grateful, sitting there, that I hadn't needed him to believe it. I just needed to keep showing up for it, one ordinary evening at a time, until it became real enough to sit inside of. Alina sat 2 mugs down, sat across from me, and didn't ask me anything else that night. She just let the quiet sit there with us, comfortable and unhurried, the way good quiet does between 2 people who've already said the parts that mattered. Sitting there with the kitchen lamp humming low, and Alina's hands wrapped loosely around her mug, I understood something that reception tent would never see. Everyone back at that wedding would remember the gasps, Renata's face going pale, the whole spectacle of it. But none of that was actually the part that mattered to me. What mattered was this: an ordinary, quiet kitchen at the end of an extraordinary night. A woman across the table who'd never once needed me to prove anything to earn her love, and enough peace in my own chest that I didn't feel the pull to replay a single second of what had just happened an hour south of here. The next morning, I stood on the back porch with a cup of coffee.
looking out toward the hills, the sky doing that pale, washed-out gray a June morning sometimes does before it decides to clear. Alina came out a few minutes later, wrapped in an old sweater she refuses to throw away no matter how many new ones I buy her, and handed me a second cup, even though I already had one going cold in my hand. She always says a cold cup of coffee is just a reminder to slow down, not a mistake to fix. She stood beside me a while before she spoke. "You knew about the affair for years before the divorce," she said quietly. "You stayed anyway. You kept trying." I did. I thought about it honestly before I answered. Because I believed if I was successful enough, patient enough, quiet enough, she'd eventually see what she had. I thought if I proved myself, she'd finally choose me the way I chose her. I took a slow sip of coffee, watching the steam curl up into the cold morning air. Alina studied me for a moment the way she does when she's about to ask the real question underneath the question. "Do you hate her after everything?" I smiled. Small, but real. The first easy smile I think I'd let myself have since the night before. "No," I said. "I forgave her a long time ago." What I hadn't forgiven, not until last night, was the version of myself who used to believe he had to earn the right to be loved. The man standing in the rain outside that conference center, thinking soaked shoes and an empty wallet were the price of being worth something. I shook my head slowly. I don't owe anybody proof anymore. Not her, not to anybody, not even myself. Alina leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stood there a long while, coffee going lukewarm in our hands, watching the wind move through the trees. The biggest win of that whole story hadn't been watching Renata's world come apart at the reception. It wasn't the literacy program reveal or Preston's fraud finally seeing daylight, or even the moment Alina walked in, wearing emerald green and turned every head in the room. The real win was quieter than all of that. It was standing on my own back porch the next morning, coffee in hand, my wife beside me, finally free of the need for anyone's applause. No reception hall gives you that. No confrontation, no scholarship reveal, no perfectly timed entrance can hand you that kind of peace. You have to build it yourself, morning by ordinary morning, long after anyone's watching to see whether you will. This story is a reminder that real healing rarely arrives with fireworks. It shows up in small, deliberate rituals that put your hands to work before doubt gets the chance to spiral. Desmond didn't win that night because he had more money than his ex-wife assumed. He won because he'd quietly built a life so steady it no longer needed her approval to stand up straight. That kind of peace is available to anyone, one ordinary morning at a time. If someone has spent years underestimating you, you don't owe them a speech. Write down what you've actually built instead, even just for yourself, even if no one else ever reads it. The way Desmond kept a notebook he never needed to show anyone to know it was true. Dignity isn't a performance for the people who doubted you. It's a day spent building something real instead of trying to convince someone of what you're already sure of. Thanks for watching. Kindly drop a comment on where you're watching from and the best part of the story and lesson you learned from the video. Bye for now.